Yeah,
Yes.
thanks, Katie. So I'm Jonathan Manning. This class will be about irrigation maintenance and repair. My experience comes from 25 years of working at a big nursery, 30 acres of nursery, and we use all the same kinds of pipe, poly tubing, timers, all that you would in your own home landscape. And obviously, over that much time, there's been a whole lot of new installs and expansions and re-expansions and layer after layer of systems, irrigation systems, and lots of things have broke over the years. So I'm going to try to share much of the experience that I've had with everyone today. And there is a lot of information in this class. I continue to learn new things because for one, doing classes and talking to people who have had different experiences with different products, mainly, new products come out all the time, especially at big box stores, hardware stores. You go and try to find the same part you bought last time, and now there's a whole new brand, whole new part, whole new system of pipe or poly or drip emitters or whatever than there was last time. So I kind of have to figure out as I go. And like I say, this class will include all the things that I've kind of figured out over the years, and mainly the most common problems that I've had to fix over and over and over again. And the maintenance part is just kind of what you should be doing to check your irrigation system and make sure that everything's okay. If you haven't been doing that, anyone can do those type of things. As far as the other repairs, I don't know where everybody's level of kind of handy is. And don't worry if I'm talking about stuff that you're probably never going to do. I figure maybe even if you hire somebody to do some of these jobs, at least you have a better idea of what should be going on, or what you're really paying for, or or if nothing else, just to have a better knowledge of what happens when they do repairs. So hopefully it won't be over anybody's head. Like I say, the information should help whether you do it yourself or not. And remember, there'll be time for questions in the end, and anything specific that I don't get to, please ask me in the questions. So let's get started. My email's there on this slide if you wanted to jot it down. I'm always good with people asking me questions over email. You could email me pictures of a problem, of your timer, of a something, whatever you want, really, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can as far as what I could do to help, or if I need other photos or whatever. So email is a good way to get a hold of me and to ask questions beyond this course. And let's get started here. So the real basics of irrigation I like to go over first, because in the end, that's what we're doing here. We're trying to keep plants alive. We're trying to make sure that the plant gets enough water to be healthy, but we're not wasting water. And that's real easy to do, especially with this class being about maintenance and repair. That's how water's wasted. Drip emitters that water a spot where a plant used to be 10 years ago and hasn't been one since. It's still putting out water in that spot, wasting water. Or broken pipes, broken polytubing, emitters that have fallen off and shoot little geysers over the yard in the middle of the night and you don't know what's happening. So there's lots of ways to save water in this class. And in the end, what we're trying to do is focus the little bit of water we do put out there on the plants to make them healthy. So these first couple slides are about just how to notice the signs that your plants can tell you in your yard, whether you're watering too much or not enough, and what's going on with that. So I like to start with too much water because it's less common, for one. And if you can eliminate that idea that it might be too much water or not, then you can move on to the more complicated problem of not being enough water. So too much water is real simple. If the ground never dries out between waterings, it could be too much. You cannot overwater a plant in one setting. I don't care if you water it for 24 hours straight, as long as it dries out again before you water it, you can't overwater a plant. So can't be too much water if the soil is drying out between waterings. You dig down a little bit into the soil. If it's dry about an inch deep, before the water system kicks on again and waters it, then it's not too much water. The problems are other problems. So you can eliminate that one pretty easy. It happens. I mean, I've seen irrigation systems that water way too often, um, especially at the wrong time of year in the winter, for example, or when it's real humid. And then it could, after weeks and weeks of never drying out, the problem of your plants might be too much water, but it is a much more rare problem. And I see many people not know whether they're watering too much or not enough. So they figure, well, I'm going to stop the irrigation and dry it out a little bit and see if that helps. And then next thing you know, the plants are all dead. So remember, it's not as common of a problem. It is possible, but the soil tells you whether it's an option or not. If the soil never dries out, maybe. So here's a couple slides about overwatering. Moss does grow here, especially north side of the house where the sun doesn't shine in the winter time and where the soil never dries out. If that soil were to dry out just for a moment, it would shrivel up that moss and kill it. So that this is just where water is constantly being applied and never has a chance to dry out between waterings. You'll see moss grow, maybe some toads come around. All right. Next one. This is another case. The plant, being the lawn would be the plant, is perfectly healthy, nice and green, full. The problem here is why it's too much water, because I followed that water in the gutter from about 3 blocks away. It's real early in the morning in the summertime. I don't know, it could be that the valve, one real common problem with irrigation systems is the valve stays on. The timer may have tried to shut it off a long time ago and it just stayed on, continuing running, and they won't find out until they get up in the morning. It also may be a program problem where they've just put in a much too long of a run time, and every day it does this, unfortunately. That could be a bigger problem, but either way, it's just too much water because the water far exceeds the needs of the plant, being the lawn. Once it ran across that sidewalk into the gutter, it's too much water. So that's a whole other reason, but it's a very common way that a lot of water is wasted in everywhere, honestly. So another lawn, little tiny lawn, which many of us have, weird shaped lawn, which a lot of them are too. And the problem here isn't the runtime or that this stayed on too long. The problem is all that, see the gravel in the very back is light kind of tan. And then as you get closer to the sidewalk, it goes dark. And there's some water on the sidewalk. There's some water washed on the side of that guy's truck. This is all a matter, it's an irrigation, repair problem too, because the sprinkler heads are the kind that are made for a much bigger lawn. So you can buy sprinkler heads that they call it the throw. So they either put the water out, 8 feet away from the head or 20 feet away from the head. And you buy them with that number on them, so that that little tiny piece of lawn maybe is only 8 feet wide and those sprinkler heads are thrown at 12, 15 feet long. So that's why you're getting all that gravel gets wet. Problem with the gravel getting wet is also that now weeds are going to grow. So you're putting weed killer out there, having to deal with the weeds, wasting water in places where you don't want any plants to be growing. All that because of the hardware of the system. The sprinkler heads of the system are not matched to the size of the lawn. So it's another real common way to just be too much water. But it's too much water in the fact that the sprinkler heads are putting out too much water for that little tiny lawn. And this could be the same as far as like drip too. You could have, putting out more water than the plant needs is just the main way to waste water in this case. Okay, so there's just a few examples of how to be too much water. There's not many. Soil dries out. Now we're back to the second problem of, is it too dry? Was it too wet or too dry? We know it's not too wet. The soil dries out between waterings, and it's not over running into the gutter and going away. So it's not too much water. So how come the plants aren't looking good, right? This is the second and much more complicated problem, and much more common problem. Most yards that I go to, that people are worried why their plants are dying, they don't look good, they're bald in the middle, they're burnt leaves, and usually it's because the plants are not getting enough water. But there's more than one way to do that, more than one way to have that happen. And I honestly, in the nursery, a lot of times people bring in some leaves of a plant or show me pictures, and the first thing I might recommend is that it looks like it's not getting enough water. Well, their response sometimes is you can't be right. I water every single day. What they're talking about is the frequency. That's only one way to not water enough. There's other ways. They might be watering every day, but just with a little sprinkle at the end of the hose, a couple minutes of sprinkling it. It's every day, but it's not enough gallons of water to soak into the bottom of that plant. So let's talk about the different ways. Oh, I'm sorry. First, we're going to look at the signs of drought. The signs of drought, because this is what you really watch for in your yard. The signs of drought, the one on the right, these are citrus trees, right, in 15-gallon pots. The one on the right is obviously wilted. If you can see, the leaves are droopy, right? If you touch them, they'd be soft, like old lettuce, like wilted lettuce. Not perky at all. They're drooping down. That's wilted. If you watered it today, problem, it would perk back up like nothing happened. If you watered it today, but it is an urgent situation. When it goes, if it went another week like this, it would be dead. But if you watered it, it would perk back up. The one on the left is fine. It's healthy. It's full. See all the leaves in the middle of the tree is what we're going to talk about next. All those tree, the tree on the left is full of leaves, not only on the tips, but in the middle of the tree also. And the difference in the tree in the middle, we're going to talk about a subtle sign of drought. It's not as drastic as the wilted one on the right, but if that one on the right were to wilt and get watered, and then wilt and get watered, and then wilt and get watered over and over and over again, like maybe your system isn't running quite often enough, or it's not quite getting enough water for this hot, dry, windy day, for example, what the tree does in response to that kind of periodic drought is to lose the leaves in the middle of the tree. The leaves in the middle of the tree are the oldest, so they don't function quite as well as the brand new ones out at the tips. And they're also in the shade of the rest of the tree, so they're not getting as much sun anymore. So if you're a tree and you're not getting quite enough water to support all the leaves you have, the ones you're going to drop off naturally to compensate are the old leaves in the middle. And if you could see inside the pot, that pot in the middle has some yellow leaves that have fallen off and onto the ground. And in the end, you just see that the tree is kind of bald in the middle. There's perky green leaves at the tip. It doesn't need water right now. The leaves that are left on the ends of the branches are perky and juicy, but the middle's kind of bald, and a lot of leaves have turned yellow and fallen out. That's from periodic drought over and over and over again. It's not getting quite enough water to maintain all the leaves like the one on the left has. So that's a little more subtle sign of drought. The one on the right obviously needs water right now. And if you see one plant in your yard, usually is like the canary in the coal mine, it'll be the one that wilts when you pushed it a little too far. And honestly, I kind of like to have that, It tells me if I wait and watch my landscape very closely, and I see something wilt like that one on the right, I know that now I'm pushing the limits of efficiency. Like I'm saving the most amount of water possible. And if I saw that, I would increase the water a little bit and keep it from doing it again. But it does tell me that I'm definitely being efficient with my watering. So it's okay that it wilts like that if you're observing often and you catch it and you increase the water to fix it. If you see that subtle sign of drought like the one in the middle, you know also that you need to increase the water just a little bit, but you are doing good as far as saving water. So that's the signs that we're going to look for. And in the end, like I say, that's all that matters. Everybody has a recommendation of how often you should water, how much you should water, what you should do with your irrigation landscape or your landscape irrigation. But in the end, your plants will tell you, because everyone has different soil. Everyone has different types of plants. Some people have more cactus, mesquites, palo verdes, and some people have queen palms and hibiscus and ficus. So it's definitely, your plants will tell you what they need. And if you know the signs of drought and know when they're needing a little more water, then that's going to be the ultimate telltale sign. No matter what any chart or book or person tells you, you should be doing. If your plants look good, you're doing good. So these are the three ways that I got ahead of myself on. There's three ways that you've seen the signs of drought now, right? The thin in the middle or the wilted, and you want to do something about it, give the plants more water. Well, there's three different ways that your plants might not be getting enough water, and these are them. And very important, the depth that the water soaks in. That's one that I see a lot of times, and this means your run time on your controller, on your timer. If your run time, say those drip emitters only are running for 15 minutes, that water is not going to soak in very far. Maybe, I mean, every soil is different. That's the problem. But the depth of that water is only going to soak in a little bit, where the roots are much deeper than that. So a lot of times I see that this is the case where maybe that water, your frequency is fine. You water every single day, but it's such a short run time, or such a short time that you're putting water on the plant, it doesn't soak down to where the roots are. So that water that just gets into the surface of the soil evaporates right back out to the air, and the roots can stay bone dry 3 feet deep underground while you're watering the top 6 inches over and over and over again. That water just goes up into the air in evaporation, and it never reaches the roots you're trying to get wet. That's a way. So now you're wasting water by just evaporating it away, and your plants are suffering from drought at the same time. So the depth is important, and the only thing that determines the depth is the run time. How long do you water for when you water for? When you water. The next one especially is pertinent to this class about irrigation maintenance and repair. This is the general rule with this is the whole area under the tree or shrub should be wet when you water. So it's very hard to do with drip emitters, especially small drip emitters like 1 gallon per hour or ½ gallon per hour, which I see installed many times in a landscape. They work great for a brand new landscape for 6 months until those plants get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it's not enough water, not enough area under the plant is getting wet when it waters. So this is a matter of adding drip emitters, changing them out to heavier flow drip emitters, and adding, we'll talk about all that. That's mainly what the end of this course will be about, is how to fix this problem. And remember, the rule is the whole area under the plant is wet when it gets watered. How do you do, if one little 1 gallon an hour drip emitter is still there from the first day the bush was planted, and now that yellow bells is 6 feet wide by 6 feet tall, you're not making a wet spot with that one little drip emitter big enough to wet all the roots of that big bush. Or trees are even harder. So this is a big problem, and we're going to talk a lot about how to fix it. The third one is the one that everyone thinks about when I say you're not watering enough. It's often enough. And that's, again, on your timer, it's the frequency. It's the date. You can use the days of the week. I prefer to use skip days or interval, and that kind of eliminates using the days of the week. But you can say I want to water every 15 days or every 17 days. To me, it's a little more flexible, and I can go longer periods in the winter without watering than just 7 days. So I won't get into that too much. It's more of a programming thing, but the frequency, I think people understand. It's the first thing that pops into their mind when I say you're not watering enough. So we're going to talk a whole lot about getting the whole area under the plant wet with adding drip emitters as the plants grow, and a little bit about depth. So the drip emitters themselves, like I say, because this is a repair class, are all important. So they're not all the same. It's hard to tell on the slides, but maybe the one on the left is on, it's running, but you'd have to hold your finger on it to see if water's even coming out. I mean, it is literally a drip, drip, drip. It's a drip coming out. The one on the right is a stream. When it's on, you can tell it's coming out. And so the one on the left is a 1 gallon per hour drip emitter, and the one on the right is a 4 gallon per hour drip emitter. It doesn't seem like that much of a difference, but we're going to talk about what difference that does make. So what I did was go back to that slide. So I laid one piece of polytubing right on top of the ground just to do this experiment. I put the 1 gallon per hour drip emitter about 4 feet away from the 4 gallon an hour drip emitter. Let them both run just on bare soil out in my backyard. Typical valley soil. The flat part of our valley is nice sandy loam. It's got a real good combination of clay and sand. And this is what happened. So after I ran it, I went to dig out the wet spot, right? And that's a little 1 foot ruler, that yellow thing in the middle. So what's the difference in those two spots as I dug out? So I dug down to where I found dry soil, right? And then measured the profile. And on the left side one, which was that 1 gallon per hour drip emitter, it soaked in about a foot, soaked in to about a foot deep. The width of that hole is only about a foot also. So then you go to the one on the right, the slide on the right. That was a 4 gallon per hour drip emitter. So a heavier drip emitter, more water's coming out at the same time. They both ran for the same amount of time. The run time was the same, about 1 hour. 2 hours, sorry. They both ran for 2 hours. So the difference on the slide on the right was how far it spread out, right? They both ran for 2 hours and they both soaked into the same depth, is what I want you to understand. The run time of 2 hours made the water soak into the same depth on both sides. It doesn't matter that one was putting out 4 gallons per hour and the other one was only 1 gallon per hour when you're talking about depth. But when you're talking about the area that gets wet, the wet spot on the ground, that how much roots actually getting wet, it changed a lot. And the width of that hole is what made the biggest difference. So more gallons per hour coming out, the wider that water is going to spread out. The longer it runs, the deeper any drip emitter will soak in, no matter how heavy it is. But the heavier the flow of the drip emitter, the wider the wet spot's going to be. And that's very, very important to what we're going to try to do here. So this is why, this is one reason why I can't tell you, make your runtime 2 hours, no matter where you live, make your runtime 2 hours. It's also why I can't tell you you should use 2 gallon per hour drip emitters in your yard, no matter what, wherever you live. Those two things change a lot with what kind of soil you have. So let's say the one in the middle is just a combination. So we're going to go from extremes. The one on the right is really dense clay soil. You probably find it in the valley somewhere. It's worse if it's gotten wet and heavy equipment has driven over it while it's wet, compacted it really, really hard, makes it like baked clay, and like cement really, and water just takes forever to penetrate it. So what you do with this kind of soil, if you, then this, you'd know it's your kind of soil if you've ever put a hose on the ground and it just stays a puddle for days, like doesn't soak in, you know, or it stays a puddle for a really, really long time. In this kind of soil with a drip system, what you want is a very, very low drip, because if you have a lot of water coming out, it's not going to soak in, it's going to go off into the gutter. So you want a very slow drip, like maybe 1 gallon per hour drip emitters, but you're going to have to run them for a run time that's ridiculously long, 4 or 5 hours, for that little tiny slow drip to finally soak in deep. We're trying to get it maybe 3 feet deep for a tree or a shrub. So that's the extreme case of this clay soil. Really slow draining soil needs a really low flow emitter and a really long run time. And that's how you get the water soaked into 3 feet deep. The beauty of it is once you do, it stays wet for a really long time. Your frequency of watering even changes, because that might only be once every 2 weeks for this soil. And then let's go to the opposite end, the sandy clay, the sandy rocky soil. You find this in the edges of town, like in this case, Verado Estrella Park might have some real chunky, gravelly, sandy soil. I've been in parts of town where you throw a hose on full blast on the ground and it just disappears into the gravel. Like, I don't know where it comes back out, somewhere downhill, but it just disappears into the ground, full blast. That kind of soil is hard to manage. So that's what you do on that. You got to go the opposite. Everything's the opposite. You need the highest flow drip emitters that you can get, maybe a 10 gallon per hour drip emitter that's really, really putting out a lot of water. So it spreads out, because it's going to soak into that soil so fast straight down that you need a lot heavy flow of water to spread out. The run time is going to be very short, because a lot of water is coming out and it's soaking in really fast, and you'll get to 3 feet deep in maybe only a half an hour. So everything's already changed. The flow of the drip emitter needs to be as heavy as you can find. The run time needs to be half an hour instead of maybe 4 or 5 hours like the other side. And then that makes the frequency much more often too. So water soaks into that sandy soil really fast. It also comes back out really fast in evaporation. So yeah, everything changes. You know, sandy, rocky soil needs heavy flow drip emitters, short run times, and very frequent watering, maybe every 3 days or something like that. So that's why you can't just follow a chart somewhere and know exactly how to program your timer. And I bring it up in a lot in this class because we're talking about drip emitters and parts of the system, the plumbing of the system. And I want you to understand that it might be different than somebody you know who lives on the other side of town with different kind of soil. So that's where we're at with all those things, just as a basis for what we're going to talk about here in a minute. Here's another thing I like people to understand. It was just kind of shocking, and it is average, right? I don't know what kind of tree they did it for, but it makes sense to me that let's go to trees on this chart. Trees, you follow it over like a, actually I can't see it because my icon's in there. So a 20 foot tree needing that much gallons of water. Okay, technical difficulties. I can't, it's 200 or something to say. It's behind my icon thing, but so look at the gallons of water and how big of a tree is. That's a tiny little tree, and that's a whole lot of gallons of water. So about 200 gallons of water. How do you get 200 gallons of water out? This is what one tree that's 20 foot tall is suspected to need in one irrigation cycle, right? They'll suck up 20 gallons of water and blow it out the leaves before they need water again. Next time your irrigation system comes on and does the same thing again. So how do you get that 200 gallons of water to come out of the system with 1 gallon per hour drip emitters? I mean, just know that the drip emitters you're using are very limited. Think about how many gallons of water, if they were in 1 gallon jugs, would you be pouring on that tree with your 1 gallon per hour drip emitter? If you're running your drip system for 1 hour and you only have one little 1 gallon per hour drip emitter on it, just imagine going out there and pouring 1 gallon of water on it and then not again maybe for a week. It doesn't seem like very much water when you look at it that way. So just don't underestimate how much gallons of water your system is putting out. Big trees and shrubs that are leafy trees and shrubs need a whole lot of gallons of water. The older they get, the more gallons of water they need. So remember the limitations of your drip system and know how many gallons of water are coming out of it. That was pretty much all that I wanted to say with that slide to remind me to talk about. So, okay. There is a handout that I've come up with that just, it was the best way I could describe going through these steps of troubleshooting the most common problems of your irrigation system. There's a little bit about maintenance and a little bit about the most common problems. So just a little, this slide is just a little bit about how irrigation systems are usually set up. There is the timer on the wall. The timer should have power from a breaker. There should be a breaker in your breaker panel that is usually just for your timer. And so regular electricity, 110, goes into your timer. All the wires that come out of your timer should be low voltage wires. So that way you don't get shocked out there in the yard when you're working on wet soil and touching wires that might be live. So all the wires that go to the valve, they are low voltage. As far as plumbing goes, the water that goes into your house is also usually connected to your irrigation system. And in a minute, there'll be a slide about what valves are what in the most common situation. People have added to these, done it themselves. Every landscaper does it different. So the plumbing can be all different kinds of ways, but more or less the water comes out of the ground from the street, goes into your house, and there should be a shutoff to shut off the entire thing, your entire property. There should be a shutoff right there coming out of the ground. Then it goes into your house, and then usually there's a hose bib for a hose, and off the side of all that comes a backflow preventer, which is legally necessary, so that if the water pressure ever went away in the street for a period of time, it wouldn't siphon the muddy water from your yard that maybe had just watered backwards into the pipes of the street. And then when the water came back on, all your neighbors would get muddy water coming out of their faucet. So that thing is necessary by law in every city I've ever seen. And so there's that little thing, and there's a valve on both sides of it if you ever have to replace it. And one of those valves you can use to shut off just the irrigation system to do a lot of the repairs we're going to talk about without shutting off your house's water. So somebody can still take a shower or do dishes while you're out working in the yard. And then at the end, as far as that goes, it goes out to valves. We'll talk about the rest in a minute here, but that slide just kind of goes through the basics of an irrigation drip system. If it was just lawn sprinklers, all that is exactly the same up to the valve. And then instead of the black poly tubing coming out of the valve, it's PVC pipe out to sprinkler heads. But everything else is the same. For detailed instructions on programming, I think the manufacturer is the best route. I do a class on programming your controller. I've done it here. And it's the hardest part is that every brand has they all do the same thing. They all have the same functions. They just have different buttons and switches and dials to do it with. And that's the part that the manufacturer can help you with if you're having trouble. You can find information about what information you want to put into your timer, but how to put it in, what buttons to push, what dials to turn, that can be helpful from the manufacturer. To either download the manual if you don't have the original owner's manual, or to get help on a helpline or email questions or something like that. So get with the manufacturer as far as details of that. I won't go too much into it in this class. But there is some things that we should maintain. So now we're just into some general maintenance that you should do to the system, right? You should check the program. At the back of this, you should check the program. And that means you should check to make sure that what you have programmed in there is still programmed in there. The run times, the start times, and the frequency for all programs, A, B, C, D, whatever ones you're using. You should check those. I would say 4 times a year. You're going to be in there. I would like people to be in there 4 or 5 times a year, changing the frequency. The only thing I change throughout the year is frequency. Once I get the start times right, they never change. Once I get the run times right, that's how deep I want the water to soak in. It's going to soak in the same depth in the winter, summer, spring, and fall. It's always the same. The run times are the same. Start time same, run time same. What I do change all the time is frequency. And remember, when it's colder, when it's hotter, when it's more humid or less humid, you're changing that. So I'd say 4 or 5 times a year, winter, spring, summer, fall, and monsoon. When it gets more humid, I back off the water a little bit, is the times. And while you're in there changing the frequency, you might as well check the rest of the program. The first thing that I notice when I open the door is the current time, if it's flashing. If the current time's flashing, it's like an alarm clock. Like if the powers went out and the time's not right, it'll flash to tell you that. If the current time is flashing on any timer, it means something's wrong. Maybe all the program got erased, maybe a little bit of it's erased, maybe just the current time's off, but something's wrong that you got to go through and check it all. And before I even started doing that, I would change the battery. Once a year, I routinely change a battery, or if you found it flashing, for sure change a battery. It's this brand of timer. Remember, they're all different. This brand of timer has a 9-volt battery right there, but they all have some kind of time or battery, and that holds your program. If the power were to even go out for a brief period and come back on, that saves your program, so you don't have to redo it. So that's one thing. Routinely once a year, or if you ever see it flashing, change the battery and then check the program. No sense checking the program if the battery's still dead, and you could lose it again any minute if something were to get unhooked or something, or the power would go out again. So the next thing is you should be able to where is that? You should be able to start you should be able to start your timer or just one valve from the timer. If worst comes to worst, the valves that are in the ground and the plastic boxes underground, there's a way to turn those on with your hand. If you can't figure it out on the timer, at least do that. You need to find a way that when you have time to go through and check the system's plumbing parts, that you can turn it on. It's nice to do it from the timer. All timers have a function to start only one valve at a time, a manual, single station manual start. And you can go to that and put how many minutes you want to run it for, just 5-10 minutes to go through and check. And that'd be a way to do it. And when that shuts off, it never does it again. It's a one-time thing just for checking it. You can also run a whole program. That means like all the valves that are supposed to come on during that program, maybe it happens in the middle of the night and you never see it. you should be able to run the whole program and follow it through and see if all those valves, if it's a bunch of valves for a big bank of lawn or something, you should be able to check and make sure they all do their thing like they're doing in the middle of the night. But whenever you have time to go through and check. And what are you checking for? There's things like this slide that where you would notice that, wow, those sprinkler heads probably need to be a little shorter throw because they're wetting the gravel and the sidewalk and all that. Maybe one is facing the wrong direction and only washing that guy's truck every morning and not even wetting the lawn. I mean, who knows? So just you're looking for sprinkler heads that are facing the right direction, throwing the right amount of water, not broken and geysers coming up. All those things you can only check while it's running, really. So figure out how to make it run, check it. As far as drip systems go, remember that the whole area under the plant should be getting wet. I would say the most common problem that I see in landscapes that's causing plants to die is that situation of one tiny drip emitter that was originally installed with the plant still trying to give enough gallons of water to a now much bigger, older plant that needs the area to be wet underneath it. So this slide is a pretty good example. With drip irrigation, it's about the best you could do. I mean, there's 4 really heavy flow drip emitters underneath this Palo Verde tree, and those 4 wet spots you see is about as best you could get to water in the whole area under the plant. And many times, like I say, I see one drip emitter still right there at the trunk that's putting out just 1 gallon per hour of water, little tiny wet spot right at the trunk where it really doesn't even need to be. The roots that are right at the trunk don't absorb water. They carry water from the tips of the roots to the leaves, but they don't absorb water anymore. So the ones that absorb, the roots that absorb water are out at the edges of the branches underground. That's called the drip line. And that's, as time goes on, you need to add drip emitters, probably heavier flow drip emitters, and put them further out toward the canopy, the edges of the canopy of the tree. But this is a good example. You see the one in the back right, that tree, it has 3 of them instead of 4, and it's the roots that are growing back to where there's a dry spot are suffering. There probably won't be any roots that grow that way because it's not getting water over there. So they need to get the whole area under the plant wet. And this is something you can look for when you manually start your drip system. Let it run its full cycle too. Let it do its thing like it always does, and then go check and make sure that all the plants are really wet underneath the entire area of the leaves as best as you can, like it is in the picture here. So that's something else you should check for. As far as drip systems go, you're checking for drip emitters that have gotten cut or broke off, and little geysers going across the yard, wet spots underground, soppy spots where you squish when you walk. All that stuff might only be happening when you water, and if you're watering in the middle of the night, for example, maybe you're not noticing these things. So you're starting it when you have time, letting it do its thing, and then going and checking for any kind of problems, basically. Dry spots too. Maybe drip emitters are clogged. Maybe that's what happened to that tree in the back. Maybe there's 4 drip emitters around that tree too, but one's clogged in the back. So you're looking for just things that don't seem right. And then the repairs kind of just follow whatever you find. But to do this routinely, at least maybe 4 times a year, and just let it do its thing, manually start it, and look for these types of problems. That's a maintenance thing we do. So, and this is all on the handout also. All this information is written on the handout to remember all those things we do. So that's the valve. If I keep talking about valve, just to know, and that's going to be underground plastic box. The plastic boxes are always tan or green, and these things are buried underground. There's only 2 wires that go back to the timer, and all those wires do is open that and shut it. So as far as maintenance goes, another thing that I would do is I put the slide in this position because so the big thing in the middle is called a Y filter, the black thing, the giant black thing with looks like a threaded cap on the end. What you do is with the water off, you unthread that cap, that black threaded cap, turn the water back on, probably with the timer, because it'll squirt in your face if you're trying to do it right there from the valve with your hand. And then just for a minute or two, turn it back off, and then go back and put that cap back on. And that gets any garbage that may have collected in that Y filter out, and set you up for probably, I would do this often if you find clogged drip emitters, or if you have a lot of different, everybody's system is different as far as how much age is one thing. The older neighborhoods get, the more calcium deposit, things like that get built up in the lines that could clog it. If you ever do a repair, especially before this valve, definitely clean that filter out, because it'll catch anything that might clog later on. And it's just a routine, another routine thing to do as far as maintenance, is clean that filter out. And like I say, you can take the whole thing apart too. The whole thing threads apart, and you can get the filter that's inside of there out and look at it. And if you see that it's really full of white, like mineral deposits, like the bottom of a teapot, that's what clogs them a lot of times. And you can soak them in vinegar, white vinegar, brush them off with a toothbrush carefully to not rip the screen, and then wash it out and put it back in. That might be something you have to do too. So you can take it out, take the inside filter out of there by unthreading the whole thing apart, inspect it, clean it if you have to. Another thing that's related to this is blowing out the system, and that's with, if you can find these end caps on your system. Unfortunately, everybody buries them. I don't know if they think it's ugly or what, but if you have to, throw a rock on top of it or something, but know where they are. And those are real important to take that cap off, turn the water on to the valve, at the valve, let some water blow out, and then turn the valve off, and then put the cap back on. And this is definitely important if you do any little repair, even if you pull out a drip emitter and put another one in. Sand and dirt and who knows what can get in that hole while you're doing it, and then go to the next drip emitter and clog it. So before you even turn the system on, if you do a repair, open that end cap before you turn the system on the first time. Turn the water on, let it blow all that stuff that might have got into the system out, and then put the cap, and then turn the water off, put the cap back on, and then check and see if anything leaks or if the repair you've done works. That's what that thing's for. But I would routinely maybe blow a little water out of it once a year or something like that too, when you check the other filter. And again, if you notice a lot of stuff built up in there, check it more or clean it out more often. If you don't find any problems with clogging, or it seems that filter seems clean when you check it, then it's maybe a once a year just in case kind of thing. So those are some maintenance things to do for the plumbing parts of the irrigation system. And this is back to that valve, which a lot of what we're going to talk about from now on is the valve, because it's really the thing the thing that goes wrong the most commonly is the valve. That's where the water either stays on when it's not supposed to stay on, or it won't come on when the timer tells it to come on. So those are the two biggest problems, two most common problems, and they both start with this valve. So it's inside that box. Those are those boxes. They could be round, they could be tan, they could be green, they could be round, they could be rectangles, but they're buried underground. I can't even tell you where they are in the yard, because I've seen people put them all right there next to the timer, and other people have one way in the back corner, one up front. So if that's what's in there though, and this is a valve. The valves are, this is even not, everybody wouldn't have the same color valve. The valve's the thing on the right, the blue thing, the green thing, whatever it is. That's the actual valve, irrigation valve. The black little canister on top with the two wires coming out of it, that's the solenoid. So this is like parts description. So the thing with the wires out of it is the solenoid, and I'll talk about that over and over and over again. So when I say the solenoid, it's the black can thing with the two wires coming out of it. Beyond that is that big Y filter I talked about already, and beyond that is a pressure reducer valve, or pressure reduction fitting, whatever, I don't know. It's a pressure reducer, and you can buy them that reduce the pressure of the whole system down to 20 psi or 30 psi. What that does is, if your water pressure in the city is so high and it blows apart fittings in your drip system, or blows drip emitters off the end of the tubing, that reduces the whole system to whatever psi you buy. And it does not reduce the flow. It doesn't reduce how many drip emitters you can have out there maximum. It just reduces the pressure that the whole system can build up to. So They're usually installed in a drip system. They're never installed in a sprinkler system. Sprinklers, you always want as much pressure as you can possibly get, but drip systems, they do have those installed on them. I don't know that it's absolutely necessary if you don't have problems with that, about the pieces blown apart, the pressure fitted pieces blown apart, but that's what it's for, and that's what it does. And so that's the parts. And remember to simplify what this valve does. All that valve can do is open and shut. When there's electricity going to it, it opens. And when there's no electricity going to it, it shuts. That's all it should ever do. Where it gets complicated is the timer tells it. The timer is where it gets complicated because the timer tells it how, when it does open, for how long to stay open for. That's your run time. And then it tells it how often to do that whole thing. That's the frequency. And then it also tells it what time of day to start doing that. Those are the complicated parts the timer's in charge of. What time of day it starts, how long it runs for, and how frequently it does that whole deal. But as far as this plumbing and electricity goes, that thing opens and shuts. That's all it does. And there could be 20 of them out there in your yard that all do different things. And there could be just one out there in your yard that just does one line of drip system or one bank of sprinklers, whatever. So that's the valve, and it's more about its parts. So the two most common problems I have with that valve we just talked about is that it stays open when it's supposed to shut. So it's working fine every time it's supposed to water, it turns on when it's supposed to, it runs for the run time, and it shuts when it's supposed to. This is the problem where you would probably show up to home, get home from being out, or wake up in the morning and there's water just everywhere running, and the drip system is running while you check it, right? And you don't think it's supposed to be running. It's never running at that time before. And we'll talk about what the steps are to check why that's happening. The other most common problem is actually the opposite. And what you would notice in this case is your plants are drying out. You don't know why. You're starting to see those wilt and signs of drought, the yellow leaves falling out of the middle, and you don't know why. And when you investigate it, it's because when you try to start it with your timer, so you would go to your timer and try to start that section manually, nothing happens. It doesn't. Your timer's not making the valve start. That's the next most common problem, and we'll talk about what to do about that too. So let's get into both of those. Number one being that you find it running, and you know it's not supposed to be. There's water everywhere. What do you do? The first thing you do is go to that timer. And this is just one brand. Remember, they're all different, but all timers should have a rain off designation. In this one, you slide that switch on the bottom in the middle all the way to the left where it says off or stop. You slide it there, and very, very importantly, don't leave it there. You only have to leave it there for about 1 minute and then put it right back to run. Because if you leave it on off, if it was me, I would forget it on off, and then it would, I would wonder what the problem is in a month from now when everything's dead. So just if you leave it on off, your whole timer never works again. So all you have to do what I'm talking about right now, you slide that over to off, or you turn your dial to off if it's a different brand, wait about a minute, and then put it back to run. So the reason you did that is because if the irrigation system does turn off, you know that your timer's telling it to run, and then when you told it with the timer to turn off, it listened and turned off. Now you know that that's a problem with your timer. And in that case, I won't get into it much. Go back through the whole program of your timer, see what's going on. Maybe you put like a 20-hour run time instead of a 20-minute run time or something like that. So check the program. It was supposed to be running. Good news is when the timer told it to stop, it turned off. And that's what you're checking. The bigger problem is you find all this water everywhere, the system's running, you turn the timer to off for the minute and put it back, and it doesn't turn off. That's a bigger problem. And then you move from the timer. It's not a program problem anymore. It's the valve problem now. So that's the first differentiation. You turn it to off, wait a minute, turn it back to run, and see what happens. If it does turn off, you check your program, figure out why it's telling it to run at this weird time and for so long. If it doesn't turn it off, now you move on down the line to the valve. And there's two things that I always find that's the problem: when the valve doesn't shut off when it's supposed to, even when the timer tells it to. And so the next, what are we doing here for detailed programmers? Yeah, and again, if you don't know how to do any of this as far as checking your program, then talk to them and see about the manufacturer. Okay, so I tried to turn this irrigation system off with the timer and it didn't turn off. And now what I do? So I go to, this is the most common setup of a irrigation plumbing that I usually see. I mean, they're, like I say, they could be different. Where my finger is the shut off I use to shut off just the irrigation system, not the whole house. The one on the right, the valve all the way to the right would shut off the entire house. You could do that too, either way. But to shut off just the irrigation system, I use the one my finger's on there, and it's off right now. Remember, any valve, if the handle is perpendicular to the pipe, it's off. And if I were to turn it parallel with the pipe, it's on. Like the other ones, they're all on. But that one, the last one that leads to the irrigation system, I turned that off. Now, obviously, the system goes off. It has to. So now you finally got the water off. At least you can relax a little bit that it's not like flowing into the gutter like it was a minute ago. So you got the water off. Then what do? You go to the valve and you take out this solenoid. And let me switch slides quick, because the worst case scenario is that all that stuff falls out. You have to be very, very careful in this case. And I've had people tell me, don't tell them to take the solenoid out because they're going to lose all those pieces. They're not all this complicated. Some solenoids, nothing comes out when you take them off. Other ones, that little spring, the plunger thing, and the rubber O-ring all can fall off. But it's like anything you're trying to take apart. If you're very careful taking it apart, and that's why you shut the water off. And when you shut the water off, the reason you shut the water off is so that water's not squirting out in your face when you do this, and you're not losing track of all the pieces. So you shut the water off, you carefully unthread it. So these come out just by threads, right? You lefty-loosey it right out of the hole. And you could even leave, in this case, you could leave the wires connected for what we're doing right now. Leave the wires connected, unthread that solenoid out of the hole, make sure anything falls out, keep track of it, put it back in the way you found it. And so what we're going to do when that solenoid is out I just kind of lay it off to the side, still hooked to the wires. I'm going to go back to the valve at the house, turn it on briefly, 1 minute, something like that. And what's going to happen is, so I turn it on, leave it for 1 minute or so, and what's going to happen is water's going to blow out of the hole where the solenoid goes. Where you took out the solenoid, water blows out of that little hole. And what usually causes this to stay on is a little tiny piece of sand, or if somebody's cut pipe, PVC pipe with a saw, a little piece of pipe dust, or a little piece of mineral deposit that just grows in the inside of pipes sometimes. Something like that clogged that little hole and won't let the valve shut like it's supposed to. So when you take the solenoid out, let some water blow out of the hole, and then shut the water back off, and then put the solenoid back on, thread it back on, put it all back together the way you found it. And like I say, hopefully you got an easy one that doesn't really have a lot of parts that fall out, but put it back the way you found it, tighten it up, not too tight, just by hand, just until it feels barely tight, and then turn the water back on. And hopefully at this point, the piece of little garbage that was blocking that blew out of the hole. And when you put it all back together and turn the water back on, hopefully you'll hear that the whole valve will make, it usually makes like a whoosh and shuts. And now you're back to normal. And if that's the case, you're good. That was all it took. And I'd say 50% of the time, that's all I got to do. But just to make sure, I go to the timer, start that valve with the manual start, and put 5 minutes on it or something, 3 minutes, whatever. and make sure it shuts. Open, shut, whatever you got to do. You can turn it on with your hand and shut it again. Just make sure that you really fixed it and it wasn't just the one random time that it shut. Open it, shut it with the timer, open it, shut it with the valve. But if it does it a couple times, you're good. That you fixed it. And I would rely on it being good for a while then. But if you do that and put the cylinder back on, turn the water back on, and it does not shut, the valve still won't shut, just comes right back on water like it was. Now you got to do a bigger job. This is one especially where you might not want to mess with it. You might want to. I've done many of them, no problem at all. You don't need a saw, you don't need glue, you don't need anything really except a screwdriver, and even then sometimes no. But this gets a little more complicated, but it's the next most common solution to that problem of the water staying on. So the parts inside they sell as a repair kit. It's very important that you buy the same exact valve that you own, right? Take pictures of any numbers on it. I don't know what else to tell you, but you got to get the same brand, same model, same everything. And what I do, a lot of times the repair kit for a valve costs just a little bit less than a whole new valve. And check it, but if that's the case, which in my experience it usually is, I just buy a whole new valve. And then it comes with a new solenoid, comes with all the parts obviously inside of it. And I take apart the brand new one and I replace everything except the bottom base cup that's piped into your system. And that's all those parts are, there's really nothing else that could be broke unless the bottom base thing is actually cracked, like got ran over by a truck or something. So usually that's what I do. I buy a whole new valve because it's only a tiny bit more money than the repair kit. But again, it has to be the exact same one that you have. And this is what I do. I take apart the old one. And so most older valves, they have all these screws holding the lid on, right? And that's these pictures are all for that kind of valve. The most recent valves that I have bought have replaced the idea of having all these screws with one big threaded nut, the whole thing. And I don't know if you guys can see in this. So no screws in the top, just that you unthread the whole thing. The whole thing comes off like this. So that is a new, again, they change brands and they change models all the time, but the most common is all these screws in the top. That's the way, and that's the most complicated, honestly. The threaded thing on top is actually kind of nice because you don't even need a screwdriver in that case. You just unthread the top and the whole thing comes apart. So one or the other of those two methods usually gets you into the insides of it. So you unthread all those screws in this case. Then you see what's inside, which is a spring, almost always. And then some valves, bigger, more complicated valves, have a lot of little parts, little O-rings, little rubber diaphragms, springs. The most common in residential use, I should say, is this kind of valve. And they're very nice that they come with, it's one spring under there and this diaphragm. And it comes in one solid unit. That's all there is inside there is that spring and that big unit thing. So again, like I buy a new valve, the bottom part that's on the bottom of this slide, that stays. Unless that's physically cracked and water squirting out the side, I don't replace that. I leave that in there because changing that is what turns this into a huge job of digging a giant hole, taking the box off the whole setup, digging a big hole, cutting pipe, gluing it back together with PVC glue and all that. It turns into a big job. And a lot of times landscapers will do that. They'll replace the valve and they'll replace that bottom piece too. And it turns into a couple $100 instead of like a $15 repair kit and 5 minutes of taking this apart and replacing everything there is to do with it other than that bottom piece. So what I do, like I say, my new valve I bought that's the same exact brand and model, I take the new one apart, take the old one apart, put everything from the new one into the base of the old one that's still in the ground without having to cut that whole thing out and repipe it in. That's the hard part. So be very careful. A lot of different brands have a little thing that lines up, you know. In this case, on the right there, there's a hole that has to line up. Just make sure you line it up the same way the old one come out, the new one goes in, exactly lined up. Here's where I've had trouble. If there's water still coming out of that hole, even though you got the water off at the house, it could be that gravity from higher spots of the system or whatever, water's bubbling out of that hole, bubbling out of that hole. Wait until it stops, because if you're trying to put that diaphragm on perfectly and then quick shut it with the top and the water floats it back out and rearranges it how it is, it's going to be a problem. So wait until maybe you find a low spot in the yard, and if there's a valve to open the end cap so the water drains backwards out of the, whatever you got to do so water stops bubbling out of that base of that valve that you have open. If nothing else, it avoids the problem of like muddy water going back in the hole, which would be a problem too. So make sure it's all the way, there can be water in there, but just make sure the water's not flowing out and making that diaphragm, the rubber thing, float around and not seat right perfectly. So you put that back in there, put the spring back on, put the lid back on, and then screw all them screws back on. And you kind of go opposites, you know, so you don't pinch that rubber thing too bad. Like putting on lug nuts or whatever, you go opposites of each other so that it goes on either way. You basically get them back on. Make sure you don't put the drill so strong. That's threading into plastic, remember. So if you're using a drill, put the clutch on where it ratchets or whatever you call it, so it doesn't, just make sure that you don't strip the screws out. It would be the point. Whatever you're doing, if you're doing it with a drill, be careful, because I've stripped out many of them going into that plastic and just spinning them out, and then there's a big problem. Then you have to go back and replace the base, like I was saying was the big job, cutting out on both sides of the pipe, big hole, big problem. So make sure you don't strip those screws out when you're putting them back in. And then you to finish that job, you would turn the water back on at the house after you got it all sealed back up. And now you got, if you used all the parts from the new valve you bought, you got a new solenoid that you would put back on. You'd have to undo the wires of the old one and do the new wires onto the new one with irrigation wire nuts. They're special with wax inside, so it seals them up and they don't corrode. So you reconnect the wires onto the system just the way they were. You screw all that back together, and now you got everything from that base plate thing up is brand new. New solenoid, new diaphragm, new lid, even everything. And then you get it all back together and you turn the water back on. And in this case, I would have the end cap of whatever system you're working on open when you first turn the water on. Let it all blow out just in case you got some muddy water down there in that valve or something. And then turn the water back off, put the end cap back on. Then now you try and see what you've done. And you turn the water on this time after you've blown it out through the end cap, you turn the water back on, and hopefully that valve shuts. And then again, you shut it and open it with the valve, shut it and open it with the timer, a couple times each, and then I would be sure afterward, if it opens and shuts that you fixed your problem. I mean, I can't guarantee that after doing all that that maybe it might not fix that problem, but in every experience I've ever had, that's the most I've had to do to fix a valve that does not shut. And again, I didn't use any glue, I didn't cut any pipe, I didn't dig a giant hole, all that. So that's all for if the system won't shut off with the timer. And then now we're talking about the next most common problem is now that you're seeing plants that are drying out, right? And you don't know why. You go to the timer and try to start each valve with the timer, and all of a sudden, you know, this one starts. If you have more than one, this one starts, but one won't. For some reason, the timer, you work your timer with a manual start to start a valve and it doesn't start. This is this problem, and it's common, very common too. the first thing I check is these wires right here. And if you see those wire nuts or regular yellow electrical wire nuts, you find these in the electrical department of any hardware store. Many people use them, and so these are wires in a regular wire nut underground in a plastic box in wet soil. So it's like the worst case scenario to rust metal. And it's not the copper wires that usually rust, it's the inside the wire nut. There's the little, I don't know what it's made out of, some kind of a metal that rusts away really, really easy. So what I do, if it's not getting the signal from the timer, the most common place that the signal's getting cut is in those wire nuts. So what I do is hold the wire nut, tug on the wires a little bit, and poof, one will fall off in my hand almost every time. And then I know that's easy fix. You just cut the wires off, restrip the ends of them, twist them back together just like they were, and put good wire nuts that you find in the irrigation department, not the electrical department. And when you find wire nuts in the irrigation department, they're filled with wax or silicone, and the whole thing is surrounded by that when you put them on, and it keeps them from corroding ever again. So that's the easiest fix for that. And then go back to the timer, try to start it, and hopefully now you got it fixed. The next thing I find though, if I do that and it's still not working, what I do is change the whole solenoid out. See the solenoid in this slide? The top of it's all cracked. I mean, our nursery's 25 years old, and there's a lot of solenoids that get old, and after a lot of use over and over in the heat and the whatever, they kind of puff out. I found them all the way exploded into nothing, and sometimes they're still working like that, miraculously enough, but it's a good sign that they're probably not going to work for long. So if you see them cracked open like that or puffed out, it's probably worth like a $10 or $15 switcheroo and just switch out the solenoid. You can buy just solenoids. Again, sometimes the whole valve is only another $5, and I buy a whole valve just to get a free solenoid and have extra parts for later. But you can buy a solenoid. Remember though, they're all different. So either take the old one off and take it to the hardware store and match it up exactly, or get the model number, whatever you got to do, but they are different. There's not like one standard amongst every brand. So make sure you replace it with the same kind of solenoid. And the way you replace it is easy. You shut off the water, remember, because anytime you unthread that solenoid, water is going to squirt out of that hole, and it makes it a disaster to try to keep track of everything that's falling out while water's squirting you in the face and whatever. So turn the water off, unthread the old solenoid, cut the wires, or just take the wire nuts off. Put the new one in, the brand new one, you thread it right back in. Reattach the wires. There's a picture of the wire nuts that are made for irrigation, and they're sealed and filled up with that wax or silicone. And you clean wires, twisted together, new wire nuts, brand new solenoid. And this is pretty much I'd say 90% of the time I do this, they start working again. This is a much simpler fix. There could be other problems. Maybe somebody chopped through the wires halfway between the timer and the solenoid with a shovel. I mean, there could be endless things in that last 10% of the time when this doesn't fix it, but this fixes it almost every time. If the timer is telling that valve to open and it doesn't open, it's usually these connections or the solenoid. So that's a little easier fix. Turn the water back on after you get that solenoid threaded in and the wires hooked up, and turn the water back on. And again, like every other thing we've done, open it and shut it with your hand a couple times at the valve, open it and shut it with the timer a couple times, make sure it's working right, and go from there. And hopefully that fixed your problem with that. So all that, it's 6:40. So that leads us to that's on a Hunter brand timer. That's just to remind me to tell you what I just did about manually starting that, seeing if it works now. Hopefully it does. Lawn sprinklers, I know I don't talk much about lawn sprinklers, but there is parts inside. That would be a pop-up head in a lawn sprinkler. There's big ones, little ones, all different brands. They're all set up a little different. but these are the basic parts. They have a hollow on the left-hand side. They have a hollow base that threads into the pipe all the way underground. I would deter anyone from unthreading that all the way out from all the way underground. At that point, you got to dig a big old hole, and water and mud falls into that PVC pipe underground. If you can leave that hollow sheath on, all the better. So the next place is at the very top, like the lawn level, there's a nut up there, like the head of the sprinkler unthreads, and then all the guts come out of that hollow shell. So that's usually, if I gotta make a change, I buy like for example, that lawn that was throwing the water too far, way past the edge of the lawn. If I wanted to change that, what I would do is figure out what brand of sprinkler heads I have right now, and I would go to the irrigation store. Like there's a few chains of irrigation stores that are specialized in irrigation here in town, and I would buy just all the way on the right hand side. There's a little tiny tip, the yellow and black thing. That's what determines how far they throw. So that's all I need. If I buy the same brand as the rest of that sprinkler head, all you got to do is pop them up, unthread that tip, and put a new tip on, adjust the angle, and then you're good. You didn't have to dig a big hole and cut a new head into the pipe or unthread the old whole thing out. So that's usually what I do if I can. If you stick with the same brand, it all works, and you can change that top head thing to full circle. You can get adjustable, the angle is adjustable on them. You can get them that throw twice as far as yours do or half as far as yours do. But if you stick with the same brand as you have right now, you can do it all without even really digging a hole. You just pop the pop-up part up, hold it with your hand, and unthread that and put the new one on and see how it runs. Again, always check it after you're done. That little blue thing is a filter. Sometimes they're there where it's placed in that picture. Sometimes they're all the way down in the base, but every sprinkler head individually should have some kind of little filter. And that's something that if a whole lawn is watering and just one head doesn't pop up very well, I'll take it apart and check that little filter, because it could be it's full of who knows what. But having that filter clogged with garbage definitely reduces the pressure. And it's usually the furthest head away from the valve. Like if you've done some repairs and got some garbage in the line and then turn the water back on, all that garbage goes all the way to the end head, the furthest one away from the valve, and clogs that filter as it pops up. So that's a common problem too. That last head or those last three heads don't pop up very well, like low pressure. The rest of the system's running fine. I would find that filter and see if it's not clogged as your problem. So you can ask questions about lawn sprinklers. I've dealt with them before. I just don't put as much in because the most common system people have is drip irrigation. But okay, polytubing repair. And here's a little note again about, it used to be called Blue Stake. Now you call 811, and what they do is they give you a time when they're going to come out. It's usually within a day or two, and they spray paint lines in your yard where the electrical and the utilities go. If you have gas, where the gas lines are, where the electrical lines are, from the street to your house at least, and the main water line from the street to your house too. So it's good just in case these jobs now you're going to be digging in the yard, and it's good to know where those are so you don't end up getting into big trouble. So this would be the case. I was walking out in the yard, there was a puddle for some reason. Only when the irrigation system runs, there's a puddle, and then it kind of goes away before it waters again, and then it comes back every time the irrigation system runs. There's either squishy soil or a wet spot or moss growing on top, or one of these signs that you might have a leak underground. And this black polytubing is never much deeper than 6 inches deep. Honestly, sometimes it's barely got gravel kicked over the top of it. And other times at the most, I've seen it 4 or 5 inches deep. So it's not a real big job to find it, but whenever you see that wet spot, you dig down, expose it real well like this. And it's hard to tell by this photo, but the water's spraying out of the hole, right? You finally got down to the tubing level, and now you see what the problem was, and water's squirting out of that polytubing. And there's a couple things it could be. The easiest problem to fix is that some old drip emitter that you probably aren't using anymore blew out of that hole or got ripped out of that hole. And now where the emitter used to be stuck in is just a round hole. And it's a really easy fix with one of these goof plugs. And I put them in with pliers. You cannot put them with your fingers. I don't know anybody who could, but so pliers work really good to poke them in the hole. And there's a fat side and a skinny side. In most cases, the skinny side is what I try first. Rarely I have to flip it over and use the fat side, but they both do the same thing. They plug a perfectly round hole. But sometimes I put it in, plug that hole, and then water still squirts out all the way around it. That means that that hole was not from an old drip emitter and it wasn't a perfectly round hole. If the plug doesn't work to fix it, it's a rip or a slit or a bubble or some other kind of misshapen hole. And in that case, you move on to a coupling. So you cut right where that, in this picture, you can see it a little better. There's a little slit. I don't know, maybe a shovel hit it or something, you know, little slit in that polytubing. I'm going to take my pruners or a pipe cutters and cut right through the middle of it. Sometimes you can, if it's just maybe a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, you can cut it out, cut the damaged part out, but don't cut too big of a gap out of it because you're going to put that thing in there. That's a compression coupling. No glue. Do not use glue on any of this stuff. It just makes it worse. It slides back apart when you use glue. So you pressure, you just push it on. And so you push it on one side, and the hard part is kind of bending both things up out of the hole and getting it back together. This is some like muddy knuckles in here. But you got to push it back together and see the distance of that coupling completely fills the space that little tiny, and this repair is for a little tiny hole or slit. So just one coupling can fill the gap of what was damaged of that tubing. And there you go. You're pretty much, the coupling replaced that portion of poly that was damaged because it was such a small hole. Same concept though, on a bigger hole, it could be 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet of damaged poly tubing, and you use the same concept, 2 couplings now. And it's a little hard to tell. There's a coupling on the left and a coupling on the right, and the whole piece in the middle is brand new poly. So here's where I will caution, the poly tubing that goes underground comes in all different sizes. The little skinny spaghetti tubing that goes up to your drip emitter is almost always 1/4 inch. It's standard all over everywhere I've ever been. The bigger tubing underground can be 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/4 metric, different brand, all different brands are slightly different. So the coupling that you're buying to use to put this back together and the piece of replacement poly tubing that you're trying to patch the hole with in the middle, all that has to match exactly the tubing that you already have underground if you're going to do this. So if it's too skinny, slightly too skinny, it'll blow back apart when you turn the water on. If it's too big, you just can't push it together no matter how hard you try. So it has to be exactly the same diameter at least as the tubing that you already have. And you have to buy the couplings that are made for that type of poly, and you have to buy the tubing that's made for that matches your existing poly. So caution on that. Remember, the spaghetti tubing that goes up to your drip emitters is always 1/4 inch. It's always the same. Comes in different materials, but it's always the same diameter. All right, that was a poly fix. I'm not going to talk much about PVC repairs. I've done millions of them, so if you have questions on them, ask me. But it just gets into one whole, a lot more complicated repairs that I wasn't sure, if the majority of people watching this presentation would be willing to do. But if you have questions about it, definitely ask me in the end. And we're going to move on to the last do-it-yourself project here. Is the most common one that should be done, and I don't see it done often enough. Wonderful way to save, to put the water where it's needed, make your plants healthier, and not waste water by putting it right there where it's not needed. So there's a little wet spot right there on that tree. This tree's 20 years old, and it still has that original little drip emitter right there by the trunk that it probably was installed with 20 years ago. Luckily, it's getting water. It's survived these 20 years because it steals water from bushes around it. It's a haphazard system that luckily kept this thing alive for this long, but it's not the healthiest situation. So that water that's right there at the trunk, remember the roots that go into the ground right there at the trunk, they don't absorb water. If they stay wet all the time, they can actually rot and ruin and kill the tree. If you're letting the system dry out between waterings, like we talked about, you should be, then that shouldn't be as much of a problem as far as the rot goes. But if it were to accidentally stay wet for a long period of time, it would cause damage to that tree, if nothing else. But it's definitely not helping because that water right there can't be absorbed by that fat root that goes right underground. That root just carries water from the tips of the roots to the leaves. So the goal here is to move that water out toward the drip line and to actually put enough gallons of water out to provide for this tree that's now much, much bigger than it was when it was first installed and has a really big root system that can absorb a lot of water and hold it for a really long time. So real quick, I want to mention that a landscape changes with age, and so brand new plants in the nursery, we have to water them almost every day in the summer, especially because they're in a little tiny pot. It only holds water for a day. There's only that much root. So we water every day. You take that plant, take it home, put it in the ground. You got to do the same thing for a while. But what's going to happen though is those roots are going to grow out of that root ball that was in the pot and then get deeper and wider and deeper and wider. And what that does is make a plant established, is what we call it. So roots growing, you want to start the watering frequency when you first start has to be pretty frequently for a brand new plant. And as the landscape gets older and older and older and older, the frequency gets further and further and further and stretched apart. A desert adapted landscape, say mesquites and palo verdes and not just cactus. I mean, I don't even put those on a drip system, but desert adapted bushes and trees, after about 5-6 years of being watered on a frequency that gets further and further and further apart, you water less and less and less often. After 5-6 years, a landscape like that might go through the whole winter without a drop of water. And it might even go through summers without water at some point when it's fully established, living on native rainfall. If they're native plants or desert adapted plants, eventually they'll live on rainfall. I mean, that's the goal. It could be possible. So how that happens is any landscape, no matter how desert adapted it is, needs water frequently when it first goes in. So as the landscape ages, you water less often and less often and less often until maybe even someday not at all. But the depth of the water from the very first day you water needs to be that 3 feet deep for a tree or shrub, because even though the roots aren't 3 feet deep, they're never going to get there if there's no water down there. So from the very first day, you're watering quite often and long enough to soak it in 3 feet deep. The 3 feet deep part, the run time, stays that way forever. But the frequency changes. As the landscape gets older, you water less often. But there's a third way to not water enough, remember? It's the area that gets wet. You want the whole area under the plant to get wet, and that area gets bigger as the plant gets bigger. So this is where this do-it-yourself project comes in. We're adding drip emitters to get more of that surface area under the plant wet. This is every year, every 2 years, as the plant gets bigger, more drip emitters, same run time, but you water less often. And the reason you can water less often is because the bigger a plant gets, the longer it can go without water. So more leaves, more roots, more stems, more trunk, all sucks up water. And I see it happen in the nursery in pots where when there's water, the roots grow to absorb it. They say like prickly pear can grow 6 or 8 feet of root in just a couple days after a rainstorm, and it sucks up that water and holds it like a tank. And then as the water runs out, the roots die back to the trunk. It's like they grow in order to store water and then die as the water goes away. So older plants and trees and shrubs can hold a lot of water. So that's the goal. On an old landscape, it's a lot of gallons of water all at once, and for long enough to soak it into the 3 feet of depth. but you can go a long time without water afterwards. So don't think because we keep adding drip emitters and adding drip emitters that you're just plain going to use more gallons of water. You need more gallons of water when you water, but you can go a lot longer without water. The plant is just capable of storing that water for longer. So I feel like I'm rambling on that topic, but it's important. So here's what we do about it. So you add drip emitters to a plant as it gets older. So here's what the things you'll need on this one from the hardware store or whatever, from the irrigation store. You need a roll of that 1/4-inch tubing. 50 feet would be plenty for a lot of do-it-yourself projects. It's cheap. I do not like vinyl. They sell it in polyethylene or whatever this is. The shiny stuff is poly, and the matte finish stuff that feels a little rubberier is vinyl. The only reason I don't like vinyl is because I've had cases where it blows back apart. It's very much easier to put together because all these things, remember, you're just going to push them together with your hands. It's easier to push together, but I've also had it blow back apart more often. I mean, maybe it's somebody's favorite, but I prefer the shiny stuff. And also they sell soaker hose in 1/4-inch. So I've done that on accident. And quick grabbed a roll of this stuff and went home and realized that it's perforated through the whole length of it. And that's soaker tubing that's 1/4-inch. So be careful. This is just regular. They call it feeder line in this brand, but it's 1/4-inch poly tubing with no perforation. So you get a roll of that, right? You get some pliers. Those little goof plugs was nice to have around. That's not a hollow tube. That's a solid thing of plastic with a fat side and a skinny side. And that orange thing on the bottom, they make a million different little kinds. They're not all orange. But every hardware store, irrigation store with the other irrigation parts, they'll have these real cheap, $1, sometimes free, and they're to poke the hole in the poly tubing. And I like to use them because I've tried nails or screwdrivers or other things, and inevitably I poke through one side and out the other side with those type of tools. And this little thing helps to stop at the right point where you don't poke through the opposite side. And it's just easier to have around. They're cheap, have a couple around. It's a good tool to have around. So those couple things as far as tools go. These are hollow in the middle. So for certain systems, you need to connect the 1/4-inch tubing to the thicker tubing underground with these little hollow couplings. So that's a hollow tube, just two different forms. They're both the same thing. But if they got a hollow tube through the middle of them, they're couplings, not goof plugs. They look kind of the same, but the difference is the hole through the middle. And we'll need those. I'll show you where we need those in a minute. These are different types of drip emitters. So if the point is to get more gallons of water out there for this bigger plant that you want the wet spot to spread out more, then you're wanting to increase the flow. You can do two things or both. You can take off the drip emitters that are on there and put drip emitters that put out more gallons of water. That'd be a good start. Maybe move them out a little bit from the trunk more toward the drip line. And then the other way is to actually dig down to the poly tubing and add more drip emitters around the tree, which inevitably was going to be also necessary. But that's the drip emitter choices. There's all different kinds. I won't get into too much about my favorites and not, but if you got questions about the different types, we will talk about how they attach to the system in a minute here. That'll be important. But there's all different kinds of drip emitters, and they all have a certain flow, so many gallons per hour. So pay attention to that. The ones you have, if they're very, very slow dripping out of them, get a heavier flow one that's 4 or 5 or even 10 gallons per hour, and it'll really make a much wider wet spot for each one that you put. So let's get started on this project. The first thing, that's that drip emitter that was right up against the trunk. The easiest way I know to find the thicker polytubing underground is to start with that drip emitter that I can see, to gently pull it up out of the gravel or the whatever ground cover you have, just dirt if it is. pull it gently up out. And when you feel a little bit of resistance, you're usually right on top of that thicker tubing. And then I like to use a trowel because it's not very deep, like a little mini shovel, and just scrape away the gravel first and dig down to where the thicker poly tubing is, to where that little tubing is attached. That's where we're going to have to do the work. Unfortunately, I had to go under curbing. So the first time I felt some resistance, I knew it was because I was going under curbing. I had to dig under a little bit, and then I found the poly tubing. But this is to remind me, I've made the mistake over and over of just digging a hole, mixing the gravel and the dirt together. And when you try to bury this hole back, you got to think ahead, because when you try to put it all back into this hole, your gravel is going to be destroyed. It gets mixed with the dirt. No matter what you do, it looks like a gravelly, muddy spot where you did the repair. It will never look the same as it did unless you buy more gravel and put it on top. So what I like to do is lay a tarp out on one side, really strip the gravel back away from where I'm going to work, really pull it back, and maybe put it on top of that tarp. Piece of plastic, tarp, a towel, on whatever, to get it out of your way. And then the dirt you dig out of the hole, also, I like to put on top of something like a tarp separately than the gravel. Put it on top of a little tarp, little piece of plastic, drop cloth, whatever. And that way it's not getting mixed in with the rest of your gravel. And when you put it all back together, it's going to look like nothing happened, you'll see. So make sure you're careful with that. Careful to get the gravel way out of your way. Careful all the dirt that you dig out of the hole you put on top of something so it doesn't get mixed in with the gravel. And then we'll go from there. So I exposed the thicker poly tubing underground. And so this is to show you the two different methods, and I shortened them up. Obviously, those two skinny 1/4 inch tubing would go far away out to where 3 or 4 feet away to where the plants are maybe. But I had to do a close up to show you that the one on the top is one method of putting drip emitters into the thick tubing. The one on the bottom is a different one. And here's the difference. The one on the top has the drip emitter, the actual emitter pokes into the thick tubing, right? And if you were to find this spaghetti tubing, the 1/4 inch tubing above ground, all you see is a hollow hole. So if you go out in your yard and you find the tubing sticking up out of the ground and there's nothing stuck on the end of it, it's because your drip emitters are all the way underground, poked into that thicker tubing. And the only kind of drip emitters that usually are used like this are the ones that look like little flying saucers. Let me go back to that slide. Bottom right with the red pokey bottom, the ones that are shaped like that, those are the ones that all these other ones are made to go above ground at the end of the spaghetti tubing. But those little flying saucer looking ones is what is in that the top spaghetti tubing is reduced. The pressure's reduced right there. The beauty of this for high traffic areas, or if you have a puppy, what happens here is that hollow tube that comes above ground, it can get cut off, chewed off, weed whacked off, whatever, and your system keeps running like nothing happened. They use it a lot in like public places where people are always walking all around. It doesn't matter. There's no drip emitter above ground to get damaged, and they continue dripping like they should because the reduction of pressure is all the way underground with that little flying saucer thing. The other way to do it is the bottom way. And so what's poked into the thicker tubing underground in that case is one of those the little hollow tubes. It's a coupling. And it pokes into the thick tubing, and then you put the drip tubing onto it, and all that is full pressure. There's full pressure in the thick tubing always. And then that full pressure goes all the way through the spaghetti tubing, the 1/4 inch tubing, all the way to above ground. And if you did not put a drip emitter on the end of it, it would squirt out of there like a geyser across the yard. So those, you have to have the drip emitter above ground, put onto the end of the 1/4 inch tubing. The benefit to this, though, is in the job that we're going to do right now, it would be much easier if your drip emitters were above ground, because you're not even digging a hole. You can take one off, put another one on. If they clog, you can take the old one off, throw it away, and put a new one on. All is above ground. So they're more adaptable, those systems. So it doesn't matter. Either one, we're going to talk about how to fix both of them. But that's the difference. And that's why sometimes some people see a hollow tube sticking out of the ground. And that's why some people see a tube with a drip emitter on the end. And I've seen many, many people that have the hollow tube sticking out of the ground, and they think, oh, I must have lost the drip emitter on that one. And they put a drip emitter on the end of it, and now they have two drip emitters on one 1/4-inch tubing. One's underground that they didn't know about, and the other one is above ground that they've added. It doesn't hurt much, but now you're just like, it's redundant is all. So that's why. That's why you might see different things popping out of the ground. And that's the two systems. Some landscapers love it one way, some landscapers do it another way, but those are the two ways to do this. And I'm going to use the drip emitters above ground in the rest of this thing. So there is that little hollow tubing that you put into the little hollow coupling that you use to attach the 1/4-inch tubing to the thicker tubing underground. And that's how you do it. So I've already poked one hole. And so this is a different spot in the underground thick tubing. I found a different spot further on, and I wanted to add drip emitters out there further toward the drip line. And this is what I would do. I would poke a hole with the orange thing or whatever kind of specially designed poker for poly. Here's a trick about that. The longer you leave it in the hole, I mean, a couple minutes, whatever, the longer you leave it in the hole, the longer the hole stays open. So if you poke it in and pull it back out, the hole shuts really quick. If you leave it in there for a minute or two and then pull it out quick and push in the other thing quick, the little barb on the end of the 1/4-inch tubing, then it goes in much easier. If you're having trouble pushing them into the hole because it's so tight, leave that little poker in there for a minute or two and it loosens up. The other thing about all these fittings when you put them together is the warmer it is, the softer it all gets and the easier it all is to put together. So maybe not first thing in the morning now that it's cooling off, for example, you do it in the afternoon. I've seen people use, man, like blow torches and lighters and things like that to heat it up. I don't recommend all that. I mean, it works, but if it's that hard to get in, maybe you got the wrong couplings or the wrong type of materials, or I would use pliers to get a good grip on it to push it in. I'm afraid with the fire method that sometimes you could deform or weaken the walls of the poly tubing to where later on you'd get a blowout if it like softened it up enough. So just a warm day though, warm time of day to do it, it helps a little bit. And holding that poker in there for a little bit longer helps keep the hole open. To put it all together. There's two of them that I added at this further out spot, followed that underground poly tubing out a ways and added 2 drip emitters out at the drip line. I'll run them in each direction probably, 3 feet this way, 3 feet that way. There's another rule. I wouldn't run the 1/4-inch tubing more than, I would say, 4 feet away from the underground thicker tubing. If you were to run that 1/4-inch tubing 20 feet, for example, your flow and pressure would be very much reduced at the end of that 20 feet. So the smaller the tubing, the shorter you can do the run. If I had to get 20 feet away, you would have to put a T in the thick tubing underground, dig a new trench 20 feet away, put the thicker tubing all the way that way underground, and then put 2 1/4-inch tubing at the end of it or whatever you're going to do. But you can't run the skinny stuff for very far. Also, another mistake I see a lot of people do is they have one spaghetti tubing, and when I say spaghetti, it's that 1/4-inch. I'll quit saying both. The 1/4-inch tubing comes up and they want to make 2 drip emitters instead of 1. So they sell these little T's, 1/4-inch T's, and you poke it in the end of where there was a drip emitter, and you make it go both ways, and you run it a little further out, and you put 2 drip emitters on there. It's limiting because so now you have less flow coming through the 1 1/4-inch poly tubing that comes up. So it's better to dig down, poke a new hole in the thicker tubing underground, and run a separate drip emitter than using those T's. Where I've really seen a problem is the method where the drip emitter is underground, poked into the thick tubing. So what I'm saying is the people who have the hollow tubing sticking up out of the ground with no drip emitter on the end, they put a T on that and then run it in two different directions. And that is definitely a no-no, because so you have the drip emitter already underground and maybe it's 1 gallon per hour, for example. It comes up, now you've made it into two, and now each one is still only trying to share 1 gallon per hour. Where the water you're getting is coming from is the drip emitter. So if it's 1 gallon per hour, it's 1 gallon per hour. Now it's just half a gallon per hour on the end of each one. So I would avoid the little 1/4 inch T's altogether. There might be certain cases where they're handy, but I see more people use them and expect to get twice as much water out of them, and they don't. So that's not as good of a fix as what we're doing here. So I've added two there. Let's move on. I use pruners to cut all this tubing, just because I always got a pair of pruners around. You can also use, I would not use a saw. It makes too rough of an edge, but any kind of like pruners, or the kind of pipe cutters that have like a razor edge on them. Pruners is probably the thing most people have around. Sharp pair of pruners works great for cutting all of it. And so now, so the last slide, this was poking them in underground. And then at the other end of the same ones, you find at the drip line where you want to put this new drip emitter, you cut it. And remember, because I have not reduced the pressure on this line yet, there was no drip emitter put into the underground poly. I'm going to have to put mine on the end. So that's called a flag emitter. And people think that when you turn the flag on the end, the green part, that it like adjusts it or makes it come out more or less. It does not do any of that. All it does is if you turn it to where a little groove lines up, the green thing comes out, and you can blow out any clogs. So it's for cleaning out the emitter is what that's for. The flag is only to, it comes out, all the garbage comes out. Honestly, I've seen roots follow the water into the drip emitter and clog their own emitter. So the roots of the tree you're trying to water grow in to follow that water into the drip emitter, clog it all up inside there. And these come in real handy if that's the case, because you can just take out the green part, blow some water out the hole, clean the whole thing out, put it back together, and make sure when you put it back on the ground that it's not like underground where the roots can grow into the hole. But I've actually found that case quite a bit. So that's just one kind of drip emitter. Here's another one. This is an adjustable emitter. They make a little sprinkler type spray out the top of them. These you turn the dial on top and they turn all the way off, and then you can turn it left all the way until it's about 10 gallons per hour coming out of it. And then right after that, the cap thing blows off and you lose it. That's the only problem I've had with adjustable emitters is you get it like maximum flow, you think, and with time it loosens up a little bit and blows off. And then you got a little geyser out there to deal with. Or sometimes I've set them to where I want as far as how much water's coming out. And I come back in a month or two and they're like half that. I don't know what causes that, but I've had reliability problems with adjustable emitters. I tend to prefer like fixed flow, and then I try to buy them like 5 gallons per hour. I've even found 10 gallon per hours that are fixed flow, but adjustable ones do the job too. You just have to maintain them more often, check them more often. And there's two kinds of adjustable ones. This one has a stake on it. The big stick going down, all it is to hold it in place. And the other ones kind of just lay sideways on the ground. That one, this one, same thing. You adjust the flow with the dial, but they just lay sideways on the ground instead of being held straight up with the stick thing. All right, dirt off of my tarp that I had it on goes back in the hole first. Then gravel that I had separate goes back on top of that. Wash it off a little bit and like nothing happened. Not like a muddy gravel hole all mixed together. So make sure that you've done that, and it should be like nothing happened, but now the trees get more water and it's drip line. So remember, any repair that you do before you turn the water on, even the first time, you open the end cap, then open the water and blow out all the stuff that you may have accidentally gotten into the system out the end, then turn the water off, then put the cap back on, then turn the water on to see what you've done, check it, make sure there's no leaks. And that whole area is wet right there, and beyond the curbing it has random drip emitters all the way around. So lots and lots of gallons of water for this old tree when it gets watered. And I got it on a 30-day irrigation cycle. So every 30 days it just gets tons of gallons of water all out by the whole area underneath the tree gets wet when it gets wet, just like good old-fashioned flood irrigation was the best there ever was, because every root that tree has gets wet when it gets watered. You know, the run time's long enough to run it, the run time's long enough to soak it in 3 feet deep, and that whole area gets wet. Every root that tree has gets wet when it waters. And an old tree like this sucks up all them gallons of water and holds it for a month through the summer, and not at all through the winter, because it's a well-adapted desert tree. And that is it of what I got to tell you. Real quick, before we switch to, I had a couple notes. And I'm going to take the, hang on, let me stop sharing my PowerPoint here. And I have a few things, if you can all see me. I have a few little, for one, everyone should have a garden hose, because if you don't remember any word that I've said this whole presentation, all you really, I mean, if you got a garden hose, you can fix any problem. So I would say if anyone says they're having a trouble with their tree, my automatic response is throw the hose on it, make a big puddle the size of the tree or shrub, and leave it that way for 4 hours. It fixes so many problems. If it was dry, it obviously fixes that. If it had salts built up in the soil, it leaches those away and washes them away beyond the roots. Other things like cement deposits, waste, whatever, it cleans the soil, really hydrates the plant, and then you can get to the issue after that. You know, why is it not getting enough water or whatever? But have a garden hose and use it whenever. Squirt plants off in the middle of summer. People are afraid that the leaves will get burnt in the full sun with droplets of water on them. That doesn't happen. I overhead water, sprinkler water, everything we grow, all 300 species in the middle of the day in the middle of summer. It just helps, you know. So wash off the dust, have a garden hose around. There, can you see this thing? This is like an egg timer thing they sell at hardware stores now. You thread it on where the hose goes. You take your hose off, you put this on, and you put the hose back on the end of it, and you turn the dial like an egg timer. And it, no batteries, no nothing. It ticks away, and you can set it for up to 2 hours. So I throw hoses on stuff all the time. I don't want to change my whole irrigation system to give extra water to that one plant that always needs it. So I throw the hose on it, and I turn this to 2 hours, and you can adjust the flow. You can still adjust the flow of how much water you want to come out the end of the hose. And I've always done that because it works wonders. What I used to do is sometimes come back in 2 or 3 days and think, oops, I forgot to turn that off. So you still have to turn the water on, but you can forget about it after you do. So when I come back and find this off, I move the hose to a different plant, turn it back on to 2 hours again. So all my hose bibs at home have these on them. And it saves a lot of water that way too, because I don't forget to turn the hose off when I go to deep soak something with the garden hose. These little battery timers, Katie, can you see and hear me? Okay.
Yep.
These, all different brands of these now too. These do have a battery in the back, but couple little AA batteries last a good year. And these do everything that the timer on your house does, but only for one, whatever comes out the end of it. Could be a garden hose going out to something, could be a whole drip system. Could be one sprinkler for your new lawn seed, whatever. But I use these all the time too. So you can do everything with this as you can with the regular timers that are on a house. You hook it up to your hose bib. Whatever comes out the other end is what's going to water, and you can make it. You can give it a run time, how long you want it to open for. You can give it what time, a start time, what time of day you want to do that, and you can give it a frequency. How often do you want to do that? Anything from every couple hours to every 7 days or something like that. So these are handy too, to like supplement the other rest of your irrigation system. Or if you don't have an irrigation system and want to automate for vacation or something, these are about 30-40 bucks in most hardware stores. And the little egg timer thing that shuts off the water for me is only about 15 in hardware stores. So those two things I wanted to make sure and mention before we get to questions. And the last little note was about when you buy any parts for irrigation system, make sure quality is there, especially in poly tubing is a good example. Like anything, so poly tubing comes in PVC pipe for that matter, both. They come in, the outside diameter could be exactly the same, but they're made out of thicker material or thinner material. So make sure you're buying, PVC pipe comes in like 2 thicknesses usually, wall thicknesses, and poly tubing I've seen come from almost paper thin, the cheapest poly tubing you can buy. I mean, you could almost rip it with your hands, it's so thin. Same, if it's 3/4, it's 3/4, that's the outside diameter, but the wall thickness can vary greatly and still be called 3/4 inch poly. So be careful with quality, that you get what you pay for, basically. The more you pay for, good quality professional stuff is going to last a lot longer and not have problems in the future as trying to get the cheapest parts that you can find. And this book, Katie, do you know this book? You familiar with that memoir book? Where would be the best place to find one of these? I love this book.
We have that book online on our website.
Let's see if I can get it.
I have some back at the office.
So it is from AMWA is the organization that puts them out, right?
Yep.
It has a web. What?
We have copies of it, or I can send it digitally to people.
Yeah, this is a wonderful one. There's a lot of free literature from them, and it's about irrigation and saving water. It's all wonderful stuff, but this one in particular, it talks about designing a landscape irrigation system. It talks about much more than I just talked about right now, honestly, and much more details. And so for even more information, this book is free. It's free and has all kinds of information on design. I didn't talk much about design at all, but all those things that you might want to get into with really doing up a landscape irrigation system. And that's it. Do you have questions?
Thank you, Jonathan. Just so you know, there's 6 minutes left.
Okay. It was a lot of information. I tried.
A lot of information, yeah. So I didn't get any questions in the chat. So if anybody does have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself. You're welcome to put the camera on too if you like. Anyone?
I must have covered everything.
Any questions?
At this point, I guess too, because it did take so long. I mean, if somebody can they just sign out if they got what they needed, or is there something that you got to talk about the survey or anything, or can they?
Yeah, so I'm going to be sending out a survey tomorrow, and then you just have to fill out the survey, and you will get the gift cards if you are a resident of Arizona and of Goodyear and do receive your water from the city of Goodyear. Okay, this looks like a question. What is the name of the book?
The cover says Xeriscape and Landscape with Style in Arizona Desert, step by step. There's a website that says www.landscapewithstyle.com. Landscapewithstyle.com. And the AMWA website actually has, I think, all that stuff too. AMWA, it's Arizona Municipal Water Users Association.
Yep.
So AMWA, AMWUA. If you just search AMWA, it'll be right the first thing. And they have all kinds of information and these free literature that they promote. Yeah.
Next question is, I am having trouble finding the 1/2 inch couplers. Can I get them on at Amazon?
Yeah, you could. I never have, honestly, but you know what I would do instead is there's because I like to bring in a piece. If you have a little extra piece of your tubing, it's good to try it if you can and make sure just in person in your hands, and that's what you couldn't do on Amazon. So there's 3 irrigation irrigation store chains. One is Ewing, Ewing. The other one is Horizon, and the other one is Sprinkler World, and there's got to be one close to you. And I used to think they only sold to landscapers because every time I go, it's all commercial people in there. But they all are open to the public. They all help anyone who comes in. And I would bring a little piece of what you're looking for, a piece of the tubing that you're trying to match, or an old coupling that you're trying to match, and do it there in the store. Make sure it works. And the quality of the stuff that they sell is usually, I can't guarantee, but usually better than you would find at like a hardware store or big box store. And the people who work there are, if nothing else, that's the resource, is the people who work there know all about all this stuff, and hopefully will give you some good info about what to buy.
Great. Somebody asked for the electronic copy, and so I put that in the chat, which was amlaw.org/landscaping style.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. Anyone?
TikTok.
Oh, okay. Landscaper has PVC piping with hubs and then has feeder with no emitter, and idea is to use screwdriver to adjust flow, but some have bigger splash areas than others. Should I add emitters to get more water pressure in bigger area? Home was on a potato farm. What emitter should I use?
Okay, that here I can read with hubs. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, they're multi-heads. Like there's PVC underground. If you want to put your mic on, you can. I mean, I understand if you don't want to, but I could talk to you more about it if you wanted to. But those are called multi-heads usually, where there's PVC pipe underground, a piece comes up, and then lots of drip lines come off of that. At that point is where you adjust the flow. You can buy the little inserts that go into that head thing that comes up, where the little skinny tubing comes out. The piece that connects the tubing to that head can be bought in different flow. That's where you change the flow. And you could flow, but some have bigger splash areas. Yeah. Should I add emitters to get more water pressure and bigger area? You definitely, to get bigger area, you would add emitters. And home was on again, you would I would take off one of those heads. Maybe you can unthread. Make sure you're not unthreading the thing that goes down way underground. Make sure that's not spinning. The riser, they call it, the skinny 1/2 inch usually tubing that comes up like threaded. Make sure that stays put, and just the head. You could take off all the spaghetti tubing and unthread that head, and there's where you could take that into an irrigation store and get heavier flow emitters that poke in the same type of head is what I would do. And yeah, the first step is always, if you're having trouble with getting coverage, like if it's not spreading out enough to wet the whole area under the plant, the first step is to have the same emitters you already have, increase the flow as much as you can find, really. Up to the point where it's running off to another area, really you can get more and more flow coming out of them. So, but they have to match. Those heads that come up are a certain brand, and the little inserts that go in them are the same brand that you got to get, and the little inserts come in different flow, like different gallons per hour. So easiest would be to take one off, I think, and go have somebody help you pick bigger inserts there. And then when you take it home, you thread it back on, and you know, take out the old inserts, put the new ones in, and put the same poly tubing right back on. And that would be the easiest way to get lots more water out there. If you eventually all those are heaviest flow you can get, and then you still need more water further out, or new plants that you install further away. The system that you have with the PVC pipe underground would have to be expanded. So you would like dig down, cut into the PVC pipe, put a T and then another riser that comes up, or a T and more length of PVC pipe to a new area, and then another riser that comes up. But it's cutting and gluing PVC pipe underground, and trenching would be how to add more of those heads that come up out of the ground. So the easiest fix would be to work with the heads you already have and replace the inserts with heavier flow if you can, if that helps.
Okay, we have one last question, and that is just moved into a new build home, but 2 months later, half the plants died. Why? It looks like plants were not all day sun plant type of plants.
Yeah, if you got any pictures, you could email me. I mean, the reasons why, man, plants just died all over town this year. Even plants that always have been fine. This summer was so much harsher, but who knows? I mean, I could tell you right away if the plants were adapted to our climate, and that would be a good reason. But if they were well adapted plants to our climate, then I could email you about maybe other options like irrigation, frequency or depth or whatever. But that kind of thing, the possibilities are endless, I think, where I kill plants all the time. I mean, on accident, obviously, but there's just so many ways to do it is the hard part. But I've learned a lot. And if you send me some pictures of those to the email at the beginning of this, then maybe I could help you that way.
Okay, well, thank you. It's now 7:30, so thanks everybody for coming. And if you have questions, you can email me and I can get them to Jonathan, or you can email Jonathan directly. And I'll be sending out the survey tomorrow. Thanks so much.
Oh, great. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
We'll see you next week.
Yeah, go save some water.